Our second part of our discussion of chemistry involves chemical interactions and chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are processes that form or break a bond. These are symbolized by a chemical equation. On the left side of the equation, we have our reactants or starting substances. On the right side of the equation, we have products, our ending substances. We normally have an arrow that goes from the reactants to the products that indicates the direction of the reaction. Sometimes you will also have a double-headed arrow indicating that the reaction can go both directions. Oftentimes we will put the enzyme name above the arrow to indicate what enzyme catalyzes the reaction. So our starting substances are called reactants or substrates. A substrate is a reactant that is acted upon by an enzyme. So oftentimes in our biological chemical reactions, where we have enzymes involved, we use the term substrates, whereas in chemistry, you tend to use the word reactant. The product is the ending substance, the substance that we end up with. We must always follow the law of conservation of mass. This means if my reaction starts out with 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms, for instance in a glucose molecule, I must end up with that same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens on the other side of the equation. It all has to balance. So my reactants and products have to have the same number of atoms of each element. Energy is the capacity to do work. So potential energy is energy due to an object's position. For instance, ions on one side of the cell membrane have potential energy because they want to get either in or out of the cell. So sodium really wants to get into the cell, so it has potential energy. Chemical energy is potential energy that is stored in a molecular bond, a chemical bond. For instance, we have covalent bonds between the carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen atoms in glucose, and that is a form of chemical energy. So stored energy in those chemical bonds. We also have kinetic energy. Kinetic energy includes heat, and it's the energy of motion. So many times when we break a chemical bond, we release chemical energy, and some of that chemical energy becomes kinetic heat energy. Just like we conserve mass, we must conserve energy. So if we have a certain amount of energy on one side of the equation, we will have that same amount of energy on the other side of the equation. Enzymes are biological catalysts. They help reactions move from reactants to products by lowering the activation energy. Without an enzyme, our activation energy is this much. When we add an enzyme, it doesn't change the direction of the reaction. So the direction of the reaction from reactant to product is still the same, but it does make the activation energy lower. This means it's easier for this reaction to proceed. So at the end of this lecture on chemistry, we'll talk about some of our organic molecules, including proteins. Proteins are enzymes. So some proteins function as enzymes. So those enzymes lower the activation energy and make it easier for a reaction to proceed. We have 5 main types of chemical reactions. A decomposition reaction breaks something down. So we go from one thing that gets broken into smaller parts. A synthesis reaction puts things together, builds new things. An exchange reaction is when we take one part of one molecule and swap it for another part of another molecule. I always think of exchange reactions kind of like a do-si-do, swap your partner type reaction. Reversible reactions are reactions that can go either direction, and the law of mass action determines which direction they go. If there's more products, they'll go back towards reactants. If there's more reactants, they'll go towards products. So the reaction can go either way, and those are indicated with a double arrow, an arrow that points both left and right. And finally, we have oxidation-reduction reactions, where we're transferring electrons and hydrogens. And we'll talk more about those when we start talking about energy metabolism. The rate of a reaction is based on molecular motion and collisions. So in order to have two things react with each other, they have to run into each other. So if we have more molecules or a higher concentration, those molecules are more likely to run into each other. And when they run into each other, they may react. So this is like having our classroom filled with 50 students, and I start having you guys move around the room. It's pretty hard not to run into another student. But if there were only 10 students in the classroom, it'd be very easy to avoid the other students. So the higher the concentration of our reactants, the more likely a reaction is to occur. So there's a direct relationship between concentration and reaction rate. A higher temperature makes molecules move around more quickly. So an increased temperature will also increase reaction rates, because as those molecules move around more quickly, they're more likely to run into each other. There's a direct relationship between temperature and reaction rate as well. And the final thing that increases reaction rates is the presence of catalysts. In biological systems, these catalysts are called enzymes. So if we have an enzyme present, it will help to increase the reaction rate. So metabolism is what we call the sum of all of the chemical reactions that are happening in the body. So when we talk about someone has a fast metabolism, it means they have lots of chemical reactions going on in the body. We have two types of reactions. We have catabolism, which are energy-releasing decomposition reactions. You may remember the term exergonic from chemistry. So catabolic reactions release energy. Anabolic reactions are energy-storing or endergonic synthesis reactions. I always remember this because anabolic steroids make your muscles get bigger, and we have to synthesize new muscle proteins in order for your muscles to grow. Next, we'll talk about water and pH.